time, but it might be helpful just to kind of see is the general flow of how the Genesis 7 and into Genesis 8 unfolds. You'll see the little created chart down here at the bottom where the water levels went up. But you see the 7 days on the boat before the waters came, then the 40 days and 40 nights. You'll see the 150 days, which is really that onset of active, still the waters were coming up until day 150, and then they begin to recede. And so this 150 days, the waters begin to recede. Of course, during this time period, Noah begins to send out the dove and the raven to begin to find out if there's dry land, and eventually he disembarks. And of course, he disembarks the ark with all those that are on it, all the animals. But he's coming to a different world. I mean, you know, just no two ways about it. Any landmarks, any little hot spots that he enjoyed hanging out at, but they're gone. You know, the world is just totally different.
No one asked for direction.
Yes. Nobody's even put together a road map or anything because there are, you know, it's just gone. I was asked a few years ago, you know, where do you think the Garden of Eden is today? It's gone. It was destroyed. You know, the Garden of Eden is again, we have no point of reference to even work from.
Can I make a comment about the water?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just read a couple days ago that, I don't know if this geologist, I can't remember the details, but geologists or scientists said that they recently discovered that there's 3 times more water where, in the lake, compared to all the oceans put together. 3 times more water in the crust or wherever. They didn't really describe it. It wasn't long. It was just a little snippet.
Yeah.
How they discovered that, I don't know, but
I think I
all that water, you know, is still there.
Yeah, that is one good, you know, one question people often ask. Well, where did the water go?
It's still there.
Well, it's, you know, with over 70% of the earth covered in water, I'd say most of it's still here. And then what you're talking about is there are molecules of water trapped in some of the rocks under the Earth's surface that if they were to be released would more than cover the entire planet. So the water hasn't really gone anywhere. It's just really how the Earth's crust functions in relationship to what we do have.
And polar caps too.
True. Benjamin Silman had this comment just identifying the obvious nature of what we're talking about. Geology fully confirms the scriptural history of the event and that these animals were buried together under circumstances indicating that they were buried by the same catastrophe that destroyed them. We're trying to walk through these, trying to flesh them out a little bit. This might be a good place if you're interested in catching these notes to come back and get my PowerPoints. I'd be glad to email that stuff to you if you'd like me to. Certainly get that information to me. But the evidence for the cataclysmic events is we see the separation of the continents. If they clearly fit together, they were separated. What mechanism? The Genesis flood. Mountain ranges exist as a result of buckling and volcanic activity. Again, the Genesis flood works as a sufficient, or more than sufficient mechanism for that to exist. Fossilization is necessarily requires rapid burial. As we talked before, animals today don't fossilize, essentially. They die, carcasses are gone, bones decay, they're not preserved. And yet we have fossils all over the planet. I found seashells on this church's property before. I'm probably the only one that goes and looks for those kinds of things on the church's property, but I have. And so you have those things being preserved. And so again, the Genesis flood functions as a sufficient mechanism for that. The rock layers, as was talking about in my opening, when you drive through along the interstates, go out west, it's very prevalent. These stratified layers of sediment can only be put there because of water. Fossilized fish and oysters are found at the tops of mountains, out in the Himalayas, over in Asia. 10, 12,000 foot elevation fossilized oysters. Now, when an oyster dies, it opens up.
Correct.
These fossilized oysters are all closed.
Oh,
That means they were buried alive. They're also big ones too. Yes.
I was thinking I'd read before that other ancient cultures had deluge myths.
Yes.
But I had to double check it, so I go to, so they got Babylonians, Assyrians, Greeks, Romans, even Native Americans all have the same story in different ways. And even the Hindus have a story. And it was funny to mention that the ancient Romans were finding fossilized fish far inland and on mountains. There's actually, we still today have, even the secular historians have writings from Romans pondering why
How they got there.
fossilized fish were so far inland or up on mountains. So this is not a new thing.
No. No, we're still, man, you're still struggling with that answer. Yeah, I didn't bring in anything tonight on that, but what you're saying is right on, because there's, you would think, if this was this big a deal, flood covering the earth, and Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's 3 sons, begin to repopulate the world, you'd think that story would go with them wherever they went. And that's what we're finding is some variation of that myth, of what's called a myth, flood legend, goes with cultures all across the world.
Well, I think it's interesting too that they have found, where they have dug in some of the highest elevations where these mountains are snow-capped 365 days a year, that they have found wood, you know, in various locations. And, you know, nothing would grow up there.
Yeah.
So where did this wood, wood just didn't haul itself up the mountain. I mean, where did it come from?
I mean, wood in fossilized form or wood?
Correct,
Yeah.
correct.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, petrified, fossilized wood, yes.
Yes, sir.
I think one of the most obvious on the fossils is the striata fossils, which is the vertical fossils that land
Polystrata.
this way. And so you're talking millions of years, what they talk about layers, and it's still the same fossil. So they disprove themselves.
Yes.
Good point.
Good point.
Just going back through dinosaur bone beds, which I talked about, but I just want to bring that to you. These are all secular illustrations and titles, but you see this, you'll see a resounding theme, watery catastrophe with the Ceratopsian dinosaur graveyard, world's richest and most extensive marine bone deposit. Coelophysis drowned in a flood. Sauropod dinosaur drowned in a flood in the Sahara Desert. That didn't happen today, I know that. Whales in the desert, this is in Chile. And of course, as you know, whales don't go inland. And these fossils, there's about 20 whales about a mile inland in Chile. Well-preserved skeletons. And so you're asked the question, how do you get whales inland? I mean, it just speaks to the nature of the Genesis flood and how these animals were likely washed in at one of the early stages of the flood and buried.
What's their explanation?
I did not go back and look at that. What you're going to see in general is an explanation that talks about slow and gradual seas rising, seas going down, slow processes. And so all those previous articles about dinosaur fossils, nobody in there is saying Genesis flood. The point I'm making is what we're seeing here is water is required for all this to happen, and I'm saying the better explanation is the Genesis flood. They say slow and gradual processes.
Tommy, as you, like your, not comrades, but people who do what you do, but let's say they're not Christian, and I'm sure you've talked to them for years, and you just kind of explain, what do they say about things like this? If they know all the facts you know, and again, we're all blinded before Christ comes into our lives on many levels. I mean, do they just don't want to believe, or they kind of like,
Well,
and I know that's heavy, you're not going to know what
No, no.
everybody thinks, but like your colleagues who don't believe in a Genesis flood, who don't believe in a Christ, are they, is it their God that they just can't believe in that stuff?
I
Because
think if I could do it this way, is put a box here, and let's say this is, I'm just gonna call it a fact. And what I mean by fact is it's a dinosaur bone. Or it could be a rock, or it could be a mountain. We see it, we can observe it, we know it, we agree with it. Now, if my presupposition is A, then this is going to drive how I see this fact, and it's going to influence my interpretation of it. If my presupposition or worldview is B, I'm in all likelihood. And so what we're doing, and this is why I believe in what I call presuppositional apologetics, as opposed to evidential apologetics. I can argue all day long about the aspects of the fact. I can argue all day long about the nature of the bone, that it has red blood cells in it, it has soft tissue, it has collagen in it, it has carbon in it, and I can give you a lot of science that demonstrates, and in some cases, that could influence somebody's opinion, somebody's thoughts. But ultimately, what we recognize is people hold to their thoughts, to their opinions, on a deeper level than just information and facts. Ultimately, there's a spiritual element to the things that people hold to. And so if I'm an evolutionist per se, and I come to a dinosaur bone, I'm never going to come and say, you know, I think those creationists might just have it right. There are those rare occasions that maybe that happens. Because what I recognize is as an evolutionist, or should I say a lost person, and I'll just leave it at that. If I as a lost person begin to accept your presuppositions that God is real, God judges sin, and people die because of sin, and I accept those presuppositions, I begin to have to respond to that. It's going to impact how I live my life. And so I agree with your point, but I'm just saying people hold to this stuff on a much deeper level than we even recognize.
And they'll call it science, but it's really more of a spiritual battle than it is.
It really is.
It really is. They're not, and again, we're all blinded until He reveals it to us. So for whatever reason, we aren't Christians before we're Christians, but this is more of a scientist approach to it. So it's a life for them. It's a religion.
Yeah, it is. And I would say I have presuppositions too. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with believing in a God that I can't point to and say that He's over there. I'm okay with believing in the Bible. I don't have a problem with that. It informs how I approach my world. I don't have to run from that. But some people would look at me and say, well, you're just being religious. And if that's how you need to term it, then I'm going to have to say, okay. I don't look at it that way, but that's, say, okay. Yes, sir.
Aren't your evolutions even running today, though, changing their march and saying there is an intelligent design, but it's just not God? Isn't that?
Well, you do begin to see some of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
So it's
to stop it
accountability.
short of, yeah, okay, I'll give you a little bit. I see that.
Yeah.
But again, we're holding to something much deeper for deeper reasons.
Entropy disqualifies all of it there, scientifically. You know,
And again,
things decay,
yeah,
they don't advance.
but nature has a way of doing things. I'm being silly here, but I'm giving you a serious answer.
Yeah.
If you've watched the Ben Stein movie, what's the name of that movie? Somebody help me with that. Expelled.
Yeah.
You know, he asked the guy in the movie, I mean, he's having very serious conversations with high-end doctorate people in biology and chemistry, and he asked the guy, how did life get here on the planet? And he says, well, life came in, was kind of piggybacked on crystals. Well, that's exactly how Ben Stein responded. All right, when are you going to answer my question? So he asked him again. He wound up making the guy mad because the guy kept giving him the same answer, and Ben Stein recognized that's a zero answer. If you haven't seen the movie, it's really intriguing.
What is it?
Expelled. No intelligence allowed. Ben Stein, something.
Well, even people that have an intelligent design theory were being persecuted. It wasn't enough to say, I still believe in evolution, but I recognize that a God started the process of evolution. Those people were still being persecuted.
Yeah.
You had to completely deny any existence of a God to be in the club in these secular universities.
Yes, the very high-end establishment, the very ardent evolutionist, atheist, if you will, yes, if they get any hint that you're doing anything like that, they'll shut you down. With respect to the flood, and you were mentioning, I believe, earlier about the layering. If you'll notice, let's see where the people is. I think the guy is right here. So get a little bit of a scale. Now, from a secular geologist standpoint, sediment builds up at a very slow rate, an inch every 1,000 years, to give you an example. So if you use that principle, you're probably talking tens of thousands of years to get that to form. Now, what do you see that rock doing? That's all one rock, yes. It's got a bend in it.
Yeah.
Now, secular geologists recognizes water moving sediment is the right thing to do, but how do you get that bend in it?
Tidal
Pressure.
If that rock were dry when it bent, it would do what?
Break.
Exactly, but there aren't any breaks in it. That means that that entire rock was bent all at one time. All at one time. Which means that that entire tens of thousands of years of Earth history actually happened in probably a few days and not thousands of years. And this is really key. In fact, I keep looking for that, and I think I found one here in Middle Tennessee. It's right across from Skyline Hospital. And there's a little bit of a bend. It's not nearly that exaggerated. But there's a little bit of bend, and I'm thinking it runs about the length of 3 football fields. And it has a little bend in it, and it's the same bend up about 75 feet. And I'm thinking, of course, I see this, and I go there, and I'm thinking that, and I look at it every time I go by, because I'm thinking, that looks like it was all the way down at one time. Here's another picture of a similar thing. This is Dinosaur National Monument. And you'll see the mound of dirt on the left, uplift. There's no breaks or anything in it, which tells me that the sediment that it lifted had to have been all wet and pliable at the time that it was lifted.
Like wet cement.
Yes. Because if it was hardened rock, it would break apart.
or lava that has started to cool. It could have molded
Mhm.
that way.
Now, I'm not going to go too deep in this. Mount St. Helens really is a very good example for us of a modern day Genesis flood on a very small scale. Because a few things you need is you need to know, can you form canyons quickly? That's one of the key things. Can you get stratification laid down quickly? And Mount St. Helens erupted in May 1980. And over the course of a few days, canyons that were 100 feet deep were carved into the rock and soil. Stratified, very finely grained stratification was laid down over a matter of days. And so Mount St. Helens is actually a very good example of what I'm teaching tonight as a creationist, as someone who believes in catastrophe, that it can happen quickly. That these ideas of long gauges to form these rock layers is not necessary. Catastrophe does take care of things. Now, on another level, you were talking about the fossils earlier. This is called a polystrate fossil. Again, it's just another example of the